Hi, I'm Cliff, and this is my garage. Today, we're almost finished with the massive upgrade on the Cayman suspension. We've put in over $13,000 worth of parts, except for this one. All that's left to do is to put it all back together, and we are done. Hey, welcome back to the garage. And if this is your first time joining me, thanks for dropping by. Well, today's objective is pretty simple. Finish putting this thing back together, including installing this one little spacer. Now, there's a whole story behind this thing, and it was a major pain and a source of trauma when installing it on the other side. But we'll talk about that later. This is the final-ish episode of a whole series on upgrading the Cayman suspension to more of a track car suspension. Now, if you haven't been watching along, a good place to start would be the first episode where I lay out all the parts I'm going to install, and I'll give you a link to that up here in this corner. There's really nothing more to talk about. Let's get started. We're going to start off by reattaching the lateral control arm to the lower control arm, and it uses this bolt. However, got a little bit of a problem with it. This hole was drilled exactly for this bolt size, but it was subsequently powder coated, which means the powder coating is now lining the inside of the hole, and it's too small. This will no longer go through here. Now, there's a couple different things you can do to take care of that. One would be to use something like a tapered reamer to clear that hole out, to clean up that powder coating. The problem is this is the biggest one I own, and it is nowhere near big enough to handle taking care of that hole. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use the impact driver to push the bolt through this hole and just use the friction to cut my way through it and get rid of the powder coating and clean it up. As you can see, it just bites in and it starts threading its way through it, and it'll, when it hits the main portion, it'll stall and then it'll push its way through. It's worked on every other one. Getting it to back out again can be a bit challenging. Since we have a very, very tight fit now. All right, there we go. Unlike the front trailing arms from the Godspeed Project, this arm is asymmetrical. The stock ones kind of curve towards the center of the car as they go along, and they've mimicked that by just using a straight rod and offsetting it with this asymmetric bracket out here. So make sure that you turn it this way so that the hole is further out towards the outside of the car. This way, not good. This way, good. The bolt comes in from the bottom with the nut on the top. I've made a bit of a mistake. You need to send the bolt through to clean this out from the bottom. This back over, the bolt comes in from the bottom. And then the nut goes on top. The bolt is 19 millimeters, and this nut on the top is 21 millimeters. We're just going to tighten this up a little bit. It's kind of a pain to actually torque this down because there's a pretty high torque value when it's flopping around like this. So we'll do all that when we get to the final stages and everything is together. Okay, now for the fun part. And quite honestly, this is a whole lot easier with two people. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and tilt the wheel carrier out, drop the strut into it, and then swing it forward and bring the strut in and up into the hole, then drop the wheel carrier down onto the stud of the lower control arm. Yeah. All right, now, one of the hardest parts is just getting the strut to drop in here because it's not a tight fit, but if you get it just slightly out of alignment, it jams. Okay, and do note the double layer of gaffer's tape I've got on here to protect because I am going to be swinging this strut around close to this fender edge. Okay, and also we need to make sure that the axle shaft goes in there near the transmission. Let's swing this out, drop, strut into there, and it is jamming because I don't quite have it right. There we go. Now I'm going to pick this up, swing it to the front, aim it up into the hole in the fender, put the drive shaft back here, and here can be the tricky part, holding this up while tilting the stud in order to land on it. There. Woo. Fun times. Make sure you get the PASM wire through so it's not being pinched. And then it should all kind of just sit back down and stay. All right, coming back in. Line this back up. Make sure we're set and get the nut onto that stud from the lower control arm. Okay. Wow. Okay, I've lowered the car back down so I can use the floor jack to pick this thing up and guide it into final place and hold it. The trick here is that it's not going to look like it's going to go in. You got to push it toward the middle. You see it come up. Once it does, now you can use the floor jack to carefully guide this into place, looking at the studs. There. Now I'll go up top and I'll put the nuts on. So let's tighten down this nut for the lower control arm ball joint. Now they've got an issue here in that we've removed this and we've just put this back in. So this is not a particularly tightly fit joint at the moment. And so when this nut gets tight, it's going to start spinning. Initially, it's going to be fine, but as it draws up, it will no longer, okay, it's already doing it. It will no longer turn correct. I mean, it will no longer hold together, and that stud is just spinning. So the end of the stud on a stock lower control arm is a Torx bit, but in this Elephant Racing lower control arm, it's a hex socket. And so you have to use like an Allen wrench in there. The problem is that this is such a tight fit here, a regular Allen wrench is not going to fit in there. So I had to take a standard Allen wrench and I just used a grinder to grind it down to where it would fit. And this is just barely short enough to get in here. Okay, so now that I'm holding that, I can go ahead and tighten this up. And I really, you know what? Let's take this off. It is just in my way at the moment. And this takes a while because, of course, you can only turn this about 1/6 of a rotation each time. Okay, finally bottomed out. Stay out of my way here. Okay, got that pretty tight. Now let's go ahead, since we've got the Allen wrench in there, let's go ahead and let's take this one to torque. The target torque for this nut is 56 foot-pounds. And of course, because of the clumsy situation, the fact we have to hold the end of the stud, our answer is to use a crow's foot on our torque wrench, making sure that we have the head at 90 degrees to the body of the torque wrench. Tap this back a little bit to loosen it up. Now we're going to reconnect the axle shafts to the transmission. And if you look back at my episode on removing the rear strut where I detached the axle shafts, you'll remember that this kind of telescopes in and out. And that's because as the wheel carrier moves up and down, this distance changes a little bit. And so this has to be flexible in order to accommodate that. But if you'll remember, I had to pull back pretty hard to get it away from the hub to get to be able to lay it down. Now it clears easily. Why? Well, it's because I have already kind of preset the lower control arm to a much higher camber setting. I know I'm going to go to a much higher negative camber to get good handling on the track. And so that the way that the negative camber adjustment works is it pushes the wheel carrier out away from the car, which increases this distance. Okay, if we take and put this up here and we were to stretch it up here, we could make this reach and bolt it together. Now the problem is that you're reaching its limits, and what can happen is that if you're going with a really high negative camber, let's say around -2.25 to -2.5, you reach the limits of what this axle shaft can accommodate, and you can actually end up damaging the axle shafts, or even worse, end up yanking this hub right out of the transmission, which will be a very bad thing indeed. And that's where this comes into play. This is a 15mm spacer from Tarett Engineering. They make a variety of them for their I think between 5 and maybe 20 millimeters for various cars and transmissions, various Porsche cars and transmissions. And this extends the transmission hub out to where the axle is no longer going to be overstressed by those high negative cambers. Now, it also comes with these new longer bolts, which of course you need longer bolts in order to reach all the way through and get a good grip on this inner hub. Now, the problem is when I installed this on the other side, as soon as I tightened up, I could put all the bolts in loosely, and as soon as I tightened up even one of them, the entire transmission would lock and I could no longer turn the hubs, which confused the heck out of me. I mean, I spent quite a while trying to figure it out. I eventually just emailed Tarett Engineering because, as we all know, Tarett Engineering doesn't provide any kind of instructions with any of their products. Not in the box, not online, not from tech support. They just simply don't appear to have them. Well, in the meantime, I kept playing with it. I probably spent a total of 3 hours puzzling over this, trying to figure out what was going on. And then I finally found it. The problem is the bolts that they shipped are too long. They go all the way through both hubs, exit the back side, and then act as a set screw against the transmission. Now, it only happens on the passenger side. On the driver's side, there's plenty of clearance on the back side to where you don't have, it's not going to happen. But on the driver's side, I'm sorry, on the passenger side, it completely locked up. Now, I can kind of understand because from what I've read, the real danger on this is only on the driver's side, but it doesn't hurt to install it on both sides. Basically, I did get an answer back from Tarett just after just after I figured it out, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've heard about that happening. The bolts are too long." Well, if you had instructions, maybe you could put a note about that in the instructions. But hey, okay. Their suggestion was to just go get some washers and put them under the head of the bolt. Now, there are two things that bug me about the situation with this spacer. Well, three things actually. First of all, that there are no instructions. All right. But then number two, and well, number three, is the first two things out of your mouth as a business when something like this happens should be thank you for your order, and then we're sorry this happened, followed by some kind of corrective action on your part. Don't dump it on the customer. Say, oh my goodness, thanks for ordering this. We're sorry this happened to you. We're going to ship you some washers, or we're going to ship you the correct length bolts. They'll be there in 2 days. That's how you handle it. You don't tell the customer, hey, yeah, we've heard that happen sometimes. Go take an hour out of your day, drive all the way into town, go to Home Depot, find the washers, pay for them out of your pocket, and fix it yourself. Oh, Tarett, you make great products, but my goodness, your customer service is terrible. Now that I've vented, let's put this together. It's a wee bit clumsy. Get another one in down here on the bottom. Just the way the hub is hanging right now, it gets us at a pretty extreme angle, which makes this kind of difficult. It's better. And what I did was I just pushed up on the hub so that the strut slid all the way into the wheel carrier. Yeah, you may wonder why I'm not using an impact driver for this. For this few, I'm just really concerned. The first few, I'm really concerned about accidentally cross-threading, and I want to be able to feel the amount of tension I'm getting back from the bolt. I'm going to work this past the boot there. Looks good. Turns smoothly like it's supposed to. Let's torque these things down now. Couple things to keep in mind. One is there are two different kinds of bolts used here. If you have M8 bolts, you're going to torque these to 29 foot-pounds. If you have M10 bolts like I do, you're going to torque them to 60 foot-pounds instead. Another thing you want to, or another issue is that when you try and tighten these or torque them, the hub just begins to turn. And so the question is, how do you deal with that? Well, if you've got your wheel and tire on the other side and you could get it on the ground, then that would stop this from turning. But the way I do it is I use a 32 millimeter socket and a breaker bar to hold the axle nut that's on the far end of it. That thing is torqued to like 340 pounds, foot-pounds. And so it's not going to come loose, using it as a counter to the torque that you're putting on these. And then I do like a pattern, kind of like a wheel. I just arbitrarily say, okay, I've got pairs of bolts that are joined by this thing, whatever it is. I'm going to start with the top ones. So I'm going to take and holding the axle nut here, and I'm going to torque this to that 60 foot-pounds. Then we move to the next top one and get it. And then on to the final top one. Now that I've got all those, I'll switch to the bottoms. And I'm just working my way around, like I said, treating it like a wheel, so there's just no chance I'm deforming this somehow. All right, all done. Now, one tip that has nothing to do with this project in particular, but whenever you're reassembling something that has to be torqued down, and you're torquing some things and you're not torquing others, me anyway, I can get lost as what I've actually torqued down and what I've merely tightened. So I like to mark every fastener that I've already taken down to torque. I used to use like a Sharpie, but now it was hard to tell sometimes whether that was a Sharpie mark or whether that was just an incidental black mark. So I started using marker pens or paint markers instead. And these are great. Just shake them up a little bit. And you can go in here, and in this case, I've marked these as I've torqued these as a group. So I will just take and I will mark the hub to show, all right, these guys have been torqued down. And when I come back in a year or two or whatever it's going to be, that paint's going to be all faded, flaked off. It's obvious it's not a recent mark. If I did come back in here in short order and I was going to take this back apart when I go about retorquing all this stuff, I would just switch to a different color. I've got this entire set of paint markers, 5 different colors. And gosh, I think it was like $10. It's dirt cheap. I'll give you a link to these down in the description below as usual. So let's go ahead and put the drop link in just so that will be sitting in its correct position, which is up like that. And, honestly, we could have just easily put this in first so that this wasn't dripping down and giving us that little bit of problem. First after we got the strut in, of course, not at the very beginning. Now, I think I've got the pieces arranged correctly here with this. There's a lot of little bits and bobs here. They're all strung together. I think I've got them in the right position, that this is how it goes, and this is where the wheel carrier is. Now, why am I not sure? I mean, why am I uncertain where exactly these goes? Well, here's your answer right there. So we'll remove this nut and washer and throw it on the floor. And here, slide this through. The washer on. Put the nut on. and just leave that for right now. All right, next we'll do the tow control arm. That wasn't difficult at all. And then our last bit is to connect the drop link to the sway bar. Now, this is an adjustable drop link, so I just lengthen it a bit until it comes to the right position. And then put it on there, and we'll torque that up in a little while. Alrighty, let's start torquing this stuff down. The lateral control, or the trailing arm, the lateral control arm is another name for it, to the body is 118 foot-pounds. This one's tough. And then we mark it with our paint marker. Trailing arm to the lower control arm, we've got an 18 millimeter on the bottom, a 21 millimeter on the top, and we're going to 118 foot-pounds. Get the top wrench unjammed, and we mark both the bolt and the nut as torqued. The tow control arm to the subframe under here is 74 foot-pounds. This is critical. Make sure that you're tightening the nut, not the bolt. If you try to tighten the bolt, you're going to screw up things. You're going to screw up the washer over here. Always tighten the nut. The lower control arm to the suspension subframe, again, the same thing with that eccentric bolt. You need to tighten that to 74 foot-pounds, and you need to tighten the nut, not the bolt. The drop link to the sway bar is a little weird. You start off by torquing it to 37 foot-pounds. Then you loosen it by 90 degrees. Then you tighten it again to 48 foot-pounds. Tow control arm to the wheel carrier, 56 foot-pounds. And again, since we have to deal with a ball joint here, we're going to use a crow's foot. I tightened it down quite a bit with a regular wrench first to make sure I wouldn't have to deal with doing this a bunch of times with the crow's foot. Oh, one note on this socket in the end, but I'm pretty sure this is a Tarett Engineering tow control rod. This socket's kind of a weird thing. I could never find a hex that fit it well, in my estimation. This is a 5 millimeter. I tried a bunch of different. I could not find either a standard or a metric that would fit that really well. So I'm not sure exactly what that is in the end there. But this metric, I'm pretty sure it's a 5. A 5 fit it well enough. And finally, I believe the drop link bolt into the wheel carrier is 63 foot-pounds. And this Tarett drop link has a bolt on the end versus the funky little hex section in the middle. Much easier to grab. Finally, we're all done, at least with this part. All I got left to do is to take and put the brakes back on, the wheels and tires. Now, before you go, as always, go down there, smack that thumbs up button, give me a like on the video. Let YouTube know that you found this episode valuable and that you enjoyed it. And if you're not one of my now 6,000 subscribers, please go down there and click on that big red shiny subscribe button and join the channel. It doesn't cost you a penny. And then finally, if you want to keep up with all the other stuff I'm doing to the Cayman, including a couple of surprise new products that are going into it, go and click on that bell icon. That will turn on notifications for this channel, and that way YouTube will let you know whenever I post something new from here in Cliff's Garage. I'll see you next time.